Welcome to another episode of Crossing Cultures. In today's discussion, Phil and his co-host, Dr. Brian Howell, sit down with Dr. Mark Yarhouse, a leading expert in the topic of gender identity. If you're just discovering our show for the first time, we invite you to explore our early episodes where we engage in many thought-provoking discussions. Our past conversations have covered topics including race in the gospel, abortion, the Ukrainian refugee crisis, and more. Stay updated with our upcoming episodes by subscribing to our channel on the podcast platform of your choice or on YouTube. Regardless of what platform you use, make sure to hit the bell on our profile page to get notified when new episodes are posted. You can also follow us on Facebook or Instagram at crossing.cultures. And now, here is our next episode of Crossing Cultures titled Gender Identity.
Hi, my name is Phil Metzger, and in 1992 I moved to Moscow, Russia. From there I lived in the beautiful Central European country of Hungary, where my family and I spent the next 20 years living, learning, and sharing about Jesus. Different foods, culture, and language, but underneath it all, we discovered the most amazing people. We learned that to share the gospel effectively, we had to adjust. We had to cross cultures. Now we're back in the US and we're discovering that this country is a melting pot of culture. This show is committed to helping Christians connect to those who think, believe, and live differently than them. This is Crossing Cultures. All right, well, thanks for joining us on this episode. And as always, in this season 3, I'm joined by the amazing, the illustrious, what terms can I use for you? Dr. Brian
Not
Howell.
So much illustrious. I'll take amazing. Sure.
Okay,
sure, that works.
let's go with amazing. He's amazing. And I'm so glad that we're going to be doing this together. And we have a great guest, really great guest. I've been kind of digesting a lot of information the last couple of weeks once Brian, you had talked about bringing him on. So I'm going to let you introduce our guest and then and get us going into this episode.
Great. Yeah. And great to be here. And Phil, I like your office there. That looks nice with the guitar propped up in the back, and it's like a new setting for you.
It is. It's not my office. There is a worship practice happening at our school. We have a K through 12 school here, and they have practice at 12 o'clock here on our campus. And guess where his office is? Right next door to that. So one of my assistant pastors, he's got a cool guitar and my wife has a cool picture that was drawn by a Hungarian artist in the background. And so, yeah, I got a better setting now.
Nice. I like it. Yeah. Well, I too am really excited about this conversation today because, of course, we've been talking about trying to have some conversations around things that people are talking about in our culture and ways in which our culture is changing. And I don't think anybody would say that one of the most important issues that we're talking about right now is sexuality and issues around, gender identity and transgenderism and same-sex marriage. I mean, these are things that have really changed rapidly in the United States in kind of the Western context, but really globally, people are talking about these things in new ways. So as an anthropologist, of course, I'm really interested in the kind of cultural ramifications that this has. But I know that there are also experts in this field who've really been thinking about this a long time from a variety of viewpoints, variety of disciplinary backgrounds. And one of the best is absolutely Mark, our guest today. So he has been working on issues of transgender identity for, wow, how long have you been doing this, Mark?
Well, I've always seen people with gender identity questions, but it was such a small percentage of the population. I just never thought it would reach the kind of cultural salience that it has today. So over 20 years, but yeah.
We're talking, of course, today with Mark Yarhouse, who is the Arthur P. and Jean May Reck Chair in Psychology here at Wheaton College. He's a colleague of mine, and he's also started the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute here at Wheaton College. And this, of course, is a Christian-based, because Wheaton is a Christian-based institution, thinking theologically and psychologically and culturally about issues of sexual and gender identity. And you started this work when you were a professor at Regent University, right?
That's right.
Or did you start even before that?
Well, I was a research assistant for Stan Jones at Wheaton, and he was doing work on sexual orientation primarily, and became the provost at Wheaton, so the senior academic officer. And so I think those obligations meant that he could take on speaking and writing engagements if his research assistant, was able to step in and do some things. And so I did a lot of work that was a little bit more outward facing, and then also some writing and things like that, working with churches and families. And then when I started my career, principally it was focused on sexual identity. But again, I have a clinical practice. I'd always see families with children who were had different gender presentations that were families were just asking, what could this mean? Those types of questions. So I did that work as well, but it was most of my writing was on sexual identity until about 2015. I wrote a book. Here's what happened. Actually, I was giving talks to youth ministry conferences on sexual identity, but all of the Q&A was on gender identity, transgender experiences, gender non-binary, and it was crystal clear to me that was where the cultural conversation was moving. It was no longer the content I was teaching; it was the content, the substance of the Q&A. And so I brought an idea to my publisher, and I said, I really think this is a shift in our culture, and this wave is going to crest on the evangelical church, and I don't think the church is ready for this conversation. So they passed it around their editorial team, as they do. And they sent it back and they said, look, a lot of us know gay people, family, friends, but none of us knows anybody who's transgender. Are you sure that there's a readership for this? And, it sounds funny today, but in 2014, 2013, so I said, look, I don't know that that's going to be as important, who as this is where the next generation, these conversations are taking place. So I had written for them before, and they decided to roll the dice and issue me a contract. So this book, it's called Understanding Gender Dysphoria, was published the same month that Caitlyn Jenner transitioned. And so it ended up being it just hit at the right time, I think, for a lot of people to at least engage it, whether they agree with what I wrote or not, just to engage the topic. There just weren't that many books out at that point.
And like you're saying, Mark, this is something that, maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, people were thinking, oh, that's really marginal. We don't really need to think about that. It's a tiny percentage of the population. But, my kids just went through high school. My youngest just graduated from high school. And this is so normal. This is so normal for them to have friends who have transitioned or who are talking about transitioning, or just to have organizations in the high schools now. And, when my oldest started high school, it was still very stigmatized and very marginal and very rare to have sort of open conversations about this. But wow, this has changed fast, and the conversation has really exploded. And we're really grateful to have voices like yours in the conversation to kind of help us think about it. What are you hearing from, churches and from Christian leaders that they are running into in terms of this conversation right now? What are some of the things that you're hearing as being, some of the key topics that folks are wrestling with?
Yeah, so definitely it's coming from parents and people in youth ministry in particular saying, this is just as you said, you just had a high school senior graduate, like our kids in middle school, our kids in high school, no friends who are transitioning, or my child is wondering if they're transgender or they have we call gender dysphoria. So we're having those conversations at church levels, driven mostly in youth ministry, middle school, high school, and then parents. Not exclusively. You do have senior pastors asking, how do I wrap my head around this? Should I be preaching on this? Those types of questions. And never thought they would be preaching on it. Those types of expectations. And then sometimes it's at the level of organizational staff and hiring and things like that. What does it look like to have a staff member who's themselves navigating this and thinking about transitioning? So as a staff, do we think is that a moral issue? Is that a mental health issue? Is that something to celebrate? Like, how do we even conceptualize what we're talking about here? So at kind of every level, churches are grappling with this one.
And Mark, can I step in and ask a quick question here on that? Because I was, one of the things I loved, and I told you before we started this, I was listening to a podcast you recently did, and you did a great job of kind of putting it in the perspective of like these three lenses that in the way that people understand gender dysphoria and I think, and transgender. I'd love for you to maybe take a moment and describe those three, because I think it really helps shape the idea of, I think everybody has this assumed idea of, oh, I know what I know, and I know it's true, and that's the way it is. Yeah. And then, but the way that you kind of express these three lenses in which we can see things. And as you mentioned before in that podcast, and I'll mention it for you here, there may be other lenses, but these three were really helpful. Would you mind to just kind of briefly walk through those?
Yeah, that'd be great. So what I suggested, and I was just trying to make sense of why nobody was agreeing with anybody in this space. So like I couldn't understand what was going on. Why are we all speaking past one another? And so I came up with these three descriptions, and as you said, there could be more, but the first one is I called an integrity lens, and it like one person who I said kind of represented this view theologically argued that there's an integrity to male-female differences that God intended at creation. So this person was drawing a lot in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and saying that it's that integrity of those differences that lays the foundation for a male-female relationship that becomes a covenant of marriage. And it's in that context that general sexual behaviors to occur. And outside of that, such behavior would be morally impermissible. And then this theologian extended that and said, and so when you apply this to experiences of cross-gender identity, the person's going against the integrity of male-female differences intended by God at creation. So there's something sacred about that. So I could have called it a sacred lens too, integrity lens, sacred lens. And for that group, I would say they tend to view it then as more of a moral concern, that there's a question of doing something sinful in adopting a cross-gender or other gender identity. And so this comes into like pastoral care and ministry implications. These lenses inform policy. They're all over the place. The second lens I suggested was there are some people who view this as just a variation that occurs in nature. And over several dozens of cases or several hundreds of cases, whatever we determine the prevalence estimate is, you have variations that occur in nature. So the vast majority of people, their gender identity as a man or a woman, boy or a girl, corresponds with their biological sex, which you think of as your chromosomal presentation, your gonads, your genitalia. And so in rare instances, there's not that correspondence, that concordance. And so it's a variation that occurs in nature. It's a non-moral reality that you respond to with compassion. So you might liken it more to something like hearing loss. And so in that sense, I called it more of a disability lens because one proponent of that view framed it that way. So I used the language of the proponent. With the disability lens, if you're a Christian, you don't have to be a Christian to hold that lens. But if you are a Christian, you're agreeing with Genesis 1 and 2, but you're drawing more on the story of the fall in Genesis 3. And you're saying that the fall touches all of creation, including our sexuality and gender, and this could be the result of that. So it pulls more compassion and empathy forward. It's less inclined to maybe restore creational intent the way the integrity lens might, and more open to how do you help someone grow in spiritual maturity with a besetting condition, more of an enduring reality for that person. So it's very different ministry implications depending on the lens. Then the third lens, as I mentioned, was the diversity lens. And so my field is clearly in that space. Much of our culture is rapidly moving in this direction, but it's the idea that these variations we've described are not a moral concern to be corrected. They're not a condition to be empathized with. They are an aspect of diversity that we should be celebrating. They're part of a culture that we should be, an emerging culture we should be celebrating. And so in that sense, they're a part of the broader LGBTQ community. That's kind of where they would find their home, as an emerging culture. And if you're a Christian drawn to that lens, I suppose you would see this more as a reflection of God's creativity, and you see these variations all throughout the created order, and you celebrate them. And so I often get that question: where's the Christian account for that? And it's not a position I hold, but I want to just kind of fairly articulate each of the three positions at this point.
Well, yeah, that's really helpful, isn't it? Yeah, because in anthropology, of course, anthropology, sociology, I think in psychology as well, we've often made this distinction between sex and gender. One is the biological and one is the cultural, right? And it seems that in this diversity lens, those categories have been collapsed, and people talk about sex and gender now really interchangeably. And we aren't, in that lens, you're not supposed to really differentiate that how somebody feels about it and then how they perform their identity isn't limited by what the biological, manifestations may or may not be in their case. And so it becomes a kind of a different conversation, right? Like you just can't, we aren't using the same terms that we used to use in the past.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that this is where Christians and non-Christians who sort of see this similarly would take issue with that biological markers matter, and that there's something to that we're embodied in a way that's meant to speak to function. Like when I gave the example of hearing loss, that there's nothing being co-constructed there. I mean, there are conversations like that in how do we think about disability and how do we think about something like hearing loss. And the deaf community has its own conversation about whether it's a culture to be celebrated or a medical condition. But I think that that there, beyond Christians who grapple with this, there's many other people who would say that biological markers matter and they're not the result of social construction. And so I don't think Christians are alone in, if a Christian lands there theologically, that they would be alone in making that sort of argument. I think we're in a position in our culture with how do you make that argument in a winsome manner, I would argue, and then to do it out of respect for other views that differ with you. But we are in a diverse and pluralistic culture. So how you engage people who differ with you is going to be really important also as a model to younger Christians who these are their friends. These are their classmates. And so a generation ago, a lot of times when you disagreed with someone, their ideology, you would take them down. You would argue with them and almost use tactics that would sort of demean their character and things like that. That is not a Christian approach to this topic that I would recommend at all, just out of my own Christian commitments, but also what it models to young people today. They're looking for examples of Christians who hold convictions, but relate to people with respect for being civil to people and being respectful of how they're image bearers of God, as we say they are.
How do we engage people who think and believe differently than we do? This is the question Dr. Mark Yarhouse is currently answering. In a previous episode, Phil and his friend Nick Roach and Dave Gibbons give their answer to this question. This clip is called Treating People Like People, Not Products. Check it out.
Another conversation that we talked about the image of God and how seeing that in other people is what kind of helps our vision to fly through all those exterior factors, what we might want to discriminate or dislike them based on. And so as you're talking, it's just making me think that, we can't love this person that we would naturally hate, or maybe we've been taught to or groomed to dislike, unless we're seeing the love of God, the identity of God in them, in that person. It's so true. And it's because, again, we dehumanize people in a way in our evangelism or in the way we share Jesus. They become a goal. They become like a means to an end, where we want them in our church or we want them saved, when really the work of salvation is Christ alone. And if we really believe that, then what's our task? Well, show love without any conditions. And so you need to really listen to them and find out what they need, because the truth is they may not need your church. They maybe need another church or another type of community that's not even institutionally based, because all the institutions are being dismantled today. They're being deconstructed. And so to me, most young people do not want anything associated with an institution. And so to me, you really have to be able to see them. So what that means, Nick, is you're hitting on something really significant, because if you have to see with these people, like our theology sometimes sees them as totally depraved. They are, you see the Ephesians passage, we're dead in our trespasses and sins. There's nothing that we do good like. So there's that thinking. But there's this other side of it we don't know how to mix in, where these people that don't know Jesus, they have intrinsic value. So even if they don't ever say yes to Jesus, they are beautiful people. They have worth. They're good people. They may not be good in the sense of how we theologically define it, but their heart intent is not to do harm. They want to see the world change. I say majority of humanity probably would want that. But if you don't see that, and you only see them as totally depraved, as man, they're the outsider, they're the enemies, they're children of Satan. I go, yeah, that's why you treat them like a product. That's why they see you preaching at them like you do, and they're going to ignore you. Whereas Jesus, man, he brought himself. He saw them with so much love through the Father's eyes. He loved them just for who they were and their brokenness and their beauty. And so, to me, when our eyes have that image, where even if they're not a Christian, they carry the intrinsic value of God and who He is, because it's not a physical representation, the image of God. It's His character. And I would even argue they are experiencing supernatural power, because there's an energy literally in our bodies. There's electricity going through our bodies, and they can experience the craft of God through their body. That's why a person who doesn't know Jesus, they can be an athlete, and they can catch a ball with one hand, like way out here. They can make a tackle, just perfect timing, the right hit. When that G-force is all, that's crazy. Or you get a musician in orchestra, you go, whoa, that was inspired. They weren't Christians, but they were reflecting the image of God.
Right.
That clip came from Season 1, Episode 3 of Crossing Cultures, titled, Won't You Be My Neighbor? You can catch up on previous episodes of Crossing Cultures on any podcast platform or on YouTube. And now, back to the show.
And I'm curious, Mark, how you would, and Brian, you as well, just because you're both experts in your given field. I almost see, obviously we see generational adjustment, and very rapidly, where I'm coming from, then where my parents are at is like, wow, that's night and day. And then where my kids are at is like, oh my gosh, I can't even, this is some crazy stuff. But I was just thinking about this, those three lenses in many ways are how do you help people who are maybe almost see these as it's a compromise at each lens? Does that make sense? So we started here and then the world changed. So we moved to this lens, a more empathetic, a more compassionate lens. And then now it's changing again. And so now, how would you guys speak to people who, and I'm saying I don't believe that and I don't agree with that, but I see many, especially conservative Christians, especially older conservative Christians, who see everything as loss right now. We're losing in these, what they would call battles. How would you express this to them in ways that would be maybe helpful?
Well, I do think that I would disagree that it's a linear progression, but I do think it's a reflection of cultural shifts. And this is where I think the cross-cultural examination can be really helpful. I mean, one of the things that I would argue is that what we call today gender dysphoria, so I used that term earlier, but this refers to distress that's often associated with lack of congruence between biological sex and gender identity. So classically, it would be the person who says, I'm a woman trapped in the body of a man, that sort of transgender experience. And so we call this gender dysphoria. So euphoria, positive emotional state, dysphoria, negative emotional state. So when you have I think something like that has existed in other cultures and throughout history. So we're calling it this. We used to call it a gender identity disorder, and we stressed that it was a disorder of identity. Well, in our last nomenclature around mental illnesses, we referred to it as a dysphoria, meaning the identity discordance is not the issue. It's if it's distressing to you. So you can see that we're moving away from any sort of a claim, any sort of a true north as to what gender identity should be, and how it should relate to biological sex. And so there will be a point where Christians just disagree with the broader culture, and even those experts who get to say what is a mental health issue and what isn't. There's going to be a point here where Christians disagree with that. But I don't think it's an inevitable drift. What I say is that these three lenses coexist, but I actually don't say to the reader, pick which lens you are. I actually say, think and pray about what each lens is speaking to that's true. And think about integrating the best of those lenses into an integrated lens that is a more nuanced Christian account of where we are today. That's actually my argument in that book.
Yeah, I can imagine that, for on this topic in particular, it's really easy for people to see it, like you said, Phil, as loss and as things used to be good and now they're bad. Things used to be easy and now they're hard. But of course, for the Christian church throughout its history, we're out of step with culture. Like that's just that's a fact of being a Christian, is that you're going to be at odds with the wider culture in some way or another. But how you feel about being at odds, or how you, just sort of emotionally what that does to you, that can change a lot depending on kind of how you think about it and how you approach it, right? Like, I don't know, Mark, if you read much about sort of the cross-cultural comparison in these areas, but the area that I know the best is in the Philippines, and there's a social category in the Philippines that is a kind of a third gender, and they call it third gender in English, which is, and in Tagalog it's called the bakla. And the bakla is a physical man, a biological man who dresses and lives as a woman most of the time, not all of the time, but usually has very, kind of stereotypical feminine characteristics in how they talk and walk and move their hands, and they'll often work as nurses or florists, or it's got that kind of very very feminine, I like almost stereotype to them. And when I was in the Philippines talking to Christians, and I was just studying Christian churches, I wasn't studying sexuality or anything, but occasionally people would mention something, or some topics of sexuality would just kind of come up. And what was so interesting to me is that the Christians there had very clear ideas about what the morality of sexuality was. That sexuality was to occur in a same-sex, or in an opposite-sex marriage, monogamy. I mean, they had very orthodox theology, but they weren't like stirred up. They weren't like bothered or angry or like, triggered by the very existence of Bakla people, because it was just a category. It was a thing that existed in society. There was one woman I talked to even who had owned a beauty salon, and she would hire Bakla very intentionally as a ministry, and she wanted to share the gospel, and she wanted to help them feel loved by the church, and make sure that they felt included. And her husband was just like, yeah, that's great, they need to hear about Jesus too. Like, nobody was sort of angry about the existence of Bakla. And that's where I think we can learn something from some of these contexts where these are not new conversations. They're different, and it's not the same thing. Transgenderism in the U.S. is not the same thing as Bakla. But it's this idea that because our culture is sort of kind of coming to this, some people still have a visceral reaction that's very negative. And I think, well, as Christians, is the visceral reaction coming from our theology, or is it coming from our culture? And if it's coming from our culture, then I think we need to separate those things a little bit and say, what does it mean to like calm down and have our theology and be very clear about our theology, but not be angry or not be fearful that people exist, in these spaces.
In a previous episode, Phil had a similar thought process on the idea of compromise within our beliefs as Christians. The clip you're about to hear is titled "Compromising Our Faith." Check it out.
80% of the gay community says they grew up in church. 80% of the gay community today says, I grew up in church. What does that mean for you and me then? It means a whole bunch of things, but here's a couple of them. It means it's no longer funny when from the pulpit somebody says things like, oh, but by the grace of God, I could commit any sin except that one. It's not funny. It's not funny because there's people, 80% of the gay community grew up in a church. And immediately they're meant to feel like what they are wrestling with is worse than what anybody else is wrestling with. And it's funny because Romans 1 is an interesting passage. Romans 1, and I've studied it a lot. Romans 1, most pastors will tell you, follows a pattern, kind of it goes downward from lesser sins to worse sins. And I have heard that forever and forever and forever. And it ends, Romans 1, guess where it ends? It ends talking about homosexuality. Here's the problem with that idea. Did you know when they wrote the Bible, there was no chapters? You knew that, right? Paul didn't write chapter 1, chapter 2. So he just kept writing. Guess what Paul talks about in chapter 2? He says, and those of you who judge others are also guilty. Now think about that. If this was just one continuous long thought, those who judge others are worse than those who are wrestling with homosexuality. The point I'm trying to make is this, is that for way too long, the church has stood on a side of saying, I could never deal with that. When the reality is that 80% of the gay community says, I was in that church. I was there and I was pushed out. I was no longer made to feel like if nobody else is wrestling with what I'm wrestling with, I need to find somewhere where someone can understand what I'm dealing with. And what I'm saying is, I want to be, and I hope you would want to be, the kind of person that people who are wrestling with issues, they can talk to us. That we give enough space in our lives where people who deal with issues that are difficult can feel like they can come and they can have a conversation with us. Oh, but if I'm not careful, it'll look like I'm compromising my Christianity. Look like that to whom? Who are you trying to impress? Because Jesus came here, he left heaven, he became one of us. The Pharisees tried to point out to him how wrong he was, and he rejected it every single time. Because he came here to reach people. If you think that it would be hard for you to talk to somebody who's in a lifestyle of sin that you don't agree with, if that's hard for you, I want you to remember something, and I have to do this almost every day. I have to remember something. How hard was it for Jesus to talk to me? Because I'm pretty bad. How hard is it for Jesus to be my friend? And doesn't it make him look kind of bad? You know, I wonder if the angels are like, wow, Jesus, you're hanging out with Phil again. Ugh. Don't you know what that guy's like? And yet not one of you have ever thought that. Neither have I until I started thinking about this message. And I'll tell you why. Because when Jesus hangs out with me, he looks better. He looks better. He's willing to love somebody who's so unlovable like me. It makes him look better. It makes him look bigger. It makes him look greater. It makes his grace look stronger. It makes the truth of the gospel look that much more appealing because all have sinned and Jesus is willing to step down and talk to sinners like you and me. It's amazing. It's unbelievable.
That clip came from Season 2, Episode 8 of Crossing Cultures titled LGBTQ and Christianity. You can catch up on previous episodes of Crossing Cultures on any podcast platform or on YouTube. And now, back to the show.
Today, so many kind of in the Orthodox conservative Christian space, they believe, and I say they, not as if I'm not, but just I think there's a group of people who they really believe like we are standing in what is true, but don't, and then they blame kind of everything else as being cultural and are unable to see that they've actually been so shaped by a cultural perspective that is not based on the gospel on how to see people who are, one, transgender, homosexual, or whatever it might be, a part of the LGBTQ community. You think about the history of just America, you think that it wasn't that long ago that the whole system was against the gay community. Mm-hmm. And it was like the church agreed with that. So we found a friend in the world, so to speak, but the world changed. And who got left with the bag of hate? It was the church. And had we started from a non-cultural perspective and actually seen people the way God sees them, we would have been anti-culture then, pro-loving humanity at the right moment. What a difference it would be today in 2022 had we taken that approach. So the opposite happened. We thought it was an Orthodox theological position. Really, it was a cultural position. And now here we are in a situation where I think very few Christians understand how to connect and how to communicate and how to, without being either dismissive or feeling like they just don't know what to say. Mm-hmm. And how do we help them? And how do we respect people who are a part of the LGBT community who see this as, yeah, we're a culture that has been marginalized. And whether I agree with like you said, the nomenclature that's around it right now, it does exist. How do I help?
Mm-hmm. That phrase, getting stuck with a bag of hate, man, that's quite an image. I like that.
Isn't it true though? It's kind of true.
It is kind of true. Yeah. We just sort of like, oh, this is easy. And then suddenly, wait a minute, where are you going? Yeah. But this is kind of a clinical, like almost a therapy question, right, Mark? I mean, I imagine that you've got parents or grandparents, in your office sometimes who are like, I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know how to talk to my family member, my child, my grandchild. Yeah, how do you counsel people who are struggling to love someone?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I do is I actually introduce them to those three lenses. I wrote an article in Christianity Today that same 2015, that same year, and it's a very it's an introduction to transgender experiences using the three lenses. And I often give that to families so that people can find themselves in those lenses. And it doesn't resolve the conflicts, but it helps us sort of focus in a little bit more on the question, how did that lens come to capture something that's really meaningful to you? And you have a better conversation when you do that. Most of us don't want to listen to one another's lens and how they got there. Most of us want to declare our lens over other people. So I think sometimes of this, I don't know how if you guys have seen the reality show I Am Jazz, but Jazz Jennings is one of the youngest documented cases of a biological male raised as a girl from a very young age, about 4 or 5. And Barbara Walters has been doing interviews with Jazz and Jazz's family for many years now. And several years ago, I think Jazz might have been like 11. And Barbara Walters was interviewing Jazz and Jazz's older sister and older twin brothers. And she says to the siblings, how do you explain Jazz to your friends? And the older sister says, well, look, I tell them that it's a disorder and it's not something that she chose. And now Barbara Walters has been doing this a few years and she knows what just happened. So she looks over at Jazz and she says, Jazz, what's it like for you to hear your sister talk about you that way? And Jazz says, I don't like that word, disorder, because to be transgender is to be special or unique because that's who I am. Okay, so right now, right there in a family where you know they love each other, you have the older sister using a disability lens to talk to her peer group. She knows that they could reject Jazz. And so she takes the initiative to say it's a disorder. She didn't choose this, because the alternative would be more of that willful disobedience that comes maybe more of that integrity lens. This person made a series of bad choices. Now they're where they are. If they could make better choices, if I could just, through disputation, I could dispute them, they'd make better choices and we could get a course correction here. So, that's kind of where the sister's saying, no, it's a disorder. And Jazz hears this language and says, I can't even imagine a future where I could thrive if I thought about myself in those terms. I'm special. I'm unique because that's what this means to me. So, okay, obviously diversity lens. Now, you could imagine parents coming at this more from an integrity lens. I know that in that family, that's not the case, but those are the families I see all the time in my practice. Multiple lenses coexisting within the family. And these lenses coexist in our local churches, other institutions. And so this is part of what makes this difficult. So you say, well, what do you do from a therapy or ministry standpoint? I introduce them to the lenses to give them a little more what psychologists would call cognitive complexity, a little more perspective taking, see through the eyes of the other. To do that is not to lay down what you believe as though it's no longer true. You can retain what you believe. You can even reflect on why you believe what you believe. There's something to be said for that. But you're also hearing why your daughter sees it differently and how she came to see the diversity lens as particularly salient, and how maybe your son saw these things more as a disability lens. They're using different language. And a lot of our current culture wars are between proponents of the integrity lens and proponents of the diversity lens. They're just speaking past each other and legislating past each other. And I think that's been the crux of a lot of the culture wars through those lenses.
When I heard you say that in that podcast I listened to, it really was like my eyes kind of were opened, and you're right. Just by information, just the straightforward kind of like, here's a few different approaches that people are taking. It gave me kind of empathy on all sides. It gave me a sense of like, okay, there's a reason for that. Whether I agree is not the main issue at this moment. It's more to just understand. And you're right. It also did that for me where I said, oh, I'm not this lens, but I realized, oh, I see these things from this lens, a little bit from this lens, and I'm trying to understand this lens. So it's a very helpful tool. I want to dive into your written work on that because I think it was very helpful. Brian, you were I cut you off. You're about to ask something.
No, not at all. I don't want to pivot us to a different topic, but it did make me think of this conflict that happened recently, or maybe kind of is still happening in the the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America. There's a pastor in St. Louis. I won't go into all the details, but he identifies as a gay Christian. He's celibate, but he identifies as a gay Christian, and he was charged. Do you know the details on this, Mark? He was charged and like brought before a tribunal within the denomination because they said it was, you know, a disordered identity, that to be gay is a disordered identity. And so to call himself a gay Christian was to sort of celebrate sin. Like, even though he is very explicit about his celibacy and his, you know, sexual ethics and his, you know, absolute fidelity to, you know, the marriage order and all of that. And I think he was cleared in one way, but now there's still like people who are trying to change some of the rules in the denomination to get him to revoke his ordination. And yeah, it's the integrity lens versus the variation in nature lens. But I can only imagine that somebody who is experiencing these things would have a very hard time embracing the integrity lens like that, because then you're kind of saying, like, what are you saying about yourself, right? If you were to embrace that.
Well, and I think in that case, and I'm familiar, somewhat familiar with it, and I think in that case, I've known other people where the language of gay, to use the word gay as an adjective in front of Christian has been a real question of can you do that and be a Christian? And so it's come down to this. And I did a study of 300 celibate gay Christians that was published in book form called Costly Obedience. And it was just kind of on how they're like, what is it like for them as celibate people to like live out this path? Like, here they are, just as you described, Brian. And in a sense, they do draw from different lenses, because they're drawing from the integrity lens to say a biblical, faithful starting point is the creation story and God's purposes for sex and gender and creating the covenant of marriage. And so they begin there, but they also obviously incorporate aspects of these variations that occur in nature. They don't believe that in many cases that their attractions can just change, that you can just restore creational intent. They see that even there could be a gift in how their experiences are for them, and they could contribute to the body of Christ. And this is actually interesting. There's a letter from C.S. Lewis where he talks about a homosexual man who had written to him, and he had destroyed the letter for the sake of confidentiality. But he said, I wish I could remember this letter, because the man wrote to me and he said, I think I have certain sensibilities and a certain like things that I'm good at because of this that I could bring to the church. And what he ended up, C.S. Lewis, with in giving counsel to young Christians who were Bible study leaders, is he said, you have to help people find their vocation, their sense of purpose. And this person felt that they had that tied to their sexuality. And I think that group, that person you mentioned, is part of a group that's trying to explore that as well. If we have this enduring reality of our same-sex sexuality, and we start with this biblical faithful starting point, but we want to be faithful, and they use the descriptor A as gay, why does that preclude them from being able to serve in these ways? And I kind of agree with them on that. When this study we did, we asked people about the importance of that language, gay Christian. It wasn't important to everybody that we worked with in this study, but for those for whom it was important, they used it for all kinds of reasons. They used it because simply it's the vernacular. You're not going to go to a 16-year-old and say, what's your sexual orientation? And if they happen to have a homosexual orientation, they're not going to say, I have a homosexual orientation, because that fell out of the vernacular. They're going to say, I'm gay. And they're not going to be saying anything to you about their sexual behavior or their theology. They're just answering your question. At 16, that's exactly what they would say. So that's the hard part about that, is they're in a church with multiple generations where the word gay means something to different people at every generation. To them, it does not mean what their grandparents think it means, or to maybe the senior pastor thinks it means. So the church, the local church, is one of the few places where multiple generations coexist and talk past each other, and could mean well, but end up talking past each other. But one of them was the vernacular. One of the other reason was things like it's missional. I'm part of that community. So I would use words that would help bridge me into my own community. I want to be able to represent Christ to other LGBTQ people. And if I start using what descriptors, same-sex attracted, or I'm just going to lose people, and I'm not even through the front door. So there were like 6 or 7 reasons why people said, I like to use this word. It's meaningful to me in these ways. And I thought in that case that you're describing, Brian, there was just looking past all of the nuances of how language could be important to this group of people and saying you won't do it that way, or you can't be ordained. And I thought that was just a mistake.
And I think this is kind of where I think all three of us find our space in the world, is like this blending of like culture and then theology, this idea of like, here's like theological language, but there's also like cultural language, and there's cultural ideals, and how can they, we're kind of trampling on one in order to make one clear, or vice versa. Because I almost think of like how, you have a lot of maybe on the more conservative side of people who don't like the idea of somebody being called a gay Christian, but they also don't like the idea because for them, they hear gay and they hear lifestyle. They don't hear what you just described, Mark, as an orientation, and it's almost like there needs to be so much, I think, especially in the church, and I live in the church area, there's got to be, our like any good paper written, our terms really matter. Our definitions really matter. And there's, I think, so much of that talking over each other has to do with from just simple, I don't have the same definition you're working from. I don't know what you mean when you say that. And so maybe I could pivot just a tiny bit on this. I think it's still staying in our framework, but it comes up a lot, is the issue of pronouns as we talk about, talking past each other. How do you, so I'm in a classroom and I have 30 students and they want to be identified, and there's different, he, him, she, her, they, them. How do we navigate this kind of pronoun conversations today?
Thank you for listening to Crossing Cultures. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel or on any podcast platform. To receive notifications when new episodes are released, click the bell icon on our profile page. We also have previous seasons with loads of discussions on topics like race and the gospel, Ukrainian refugee crisis, and more. Follow us and take a look back on what God has been doing on this show. This episode was produced by Phil Metzger and Dr. Brian Howell and edited by Luis Lopez. This podcast is a ministry of Calvary San Diego. I'm your host, Keya Lopez. Stay tuned for our next episode of Crossing Cultures, where Dr. Brian Howell and Phil Metzger continue their conversation with Dr. Mark Yarhouse. This episode will be titled Exploring Perspectives on Gender Identity. You won't want to miss it.